I mentioned this to the person that I was having a conversation with this morning, that generosity is one of those things that most people expect churches to talk about, right? It's kind of an expectation. And generosity is one of those things that most people kind of start to shut down when churches begin to talk about it. So I'm pretty careful because I think sometimes the concept of generosity and giving, especially financially, it gets misconstrued in some churches, right? And misrepresented or even misused. And so I want to be careful, right? Because, and I'm going to say this a number of different times, generosity is not just financial discipline, right? Generosity isn't just being good with money. Generosity really is about trusting Jesus with all that we have and all that we are, not just our financial resources. And so let me be really clear, right? Generosity isn't just primarily about having money that you can give away. Because generosity begins when we believe that God is trustworthy enough that we don't have to hold on to everything in our lives so tightly. Generosity begins before we ever give anything away. It begins with our hearts and with this like cultivating a trust in God and who he says he is. And we see this in the book of Proverbs, right? We encounter this kind of upside down principle when it comes to generosity. It's actually a paradox. So I'm going to read these two verses. I'm going to ask, pay attention. Can you identify the principle around generosity that doesn't make sense on the surface? All right? Proverbs 11:24 and 25. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Okay, so did you pick it up? The paradox, the upside down principle, right? Solomon's wisdom is very much opposite of the wisdom of our world. Can we agree? It doesn't make sense in our North American economy at all. And one of the things that Proverbs keeps telling us over and over and over again is that wisdom isn't just having the right information. Wisdom is following God's way of life in God's world, right? And so God's way of life, according to Solomon, according to Proverbs 11, there's this upside down principle that the person who freely gives actually gains more. And let me just stop for 1 second. I am not talking about the prosperity gospel, okay? I'm not saying if you just give more money to our church that all of a sudden tomorrow you're going to have 10 times in your bank account, okay? That's not what I'm saying. So guard your hearts here. But let's lean in, right? Can we take the rest of the time we have together and can we just lean in? Because the world says if you want to be secure, if you want to be happy, if you want to be successful, what do? Go get more, right? If you want to be secure, you want to be happy, you want to be joy-filled, right? You want to have a great life, you get more money, go get more power, go get more influence, go get more followers, go get more time, right? That's the economy of the world around us. But Proverbs says very clearly, if you want genuine security, happiness, success, that comes from giving our lives away, not scavenging for more. So this is our last week. Sorry to say that the summer is ending. But this is our last week in Proverbs, pursuing the path of wisdom. I've enjoyed this summer a lot in this series. Proverbs has this way of addressing some of the daily realities that we have to wrestle with as followers of Christ. And so we've talked about the path that seems right? That was early on in our series together. There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to destruction. We've talked about our plans and then God's purposes. We've talked about the power of our words and the way that our speech shapes the world around us. We've talked about humility and pride. We've talked about the desires of our hearts and where they take us. And underneath all of these 7 or 8 sermons, right, the conversation, we've been asking the same exact question. Not what do I know, but what kind of person am I becoming? Because wisdom isn't just about having more information. Wisdom is learning to live God's way in God's world. All right, so here we are. Last week in Proverbs, I didn't count all of them, but in the 31 chapters of Proverbs, there's roughly more than a dozen, I know for sure, different references to how we use our money, our time, our resources. There's a bunch of references in Proverbs to generosity. And the time that we're going to spend together, right, Proverbs kind of holds a mirror up to specifically not just what we give away, not just our money, but specifically our trust in God. And so I'm going to ask you a question. And it's one that I've had to wrestle with throughout this week. What happens inside of you when God asks you to give something away? What goes on inside of you when you feel like God's asking you to give something away? Is there joy or resentment? Is there hopefulness to see what God's going to do with it? Is there reluctance? What happens inside of us when we are invited by God, asked by God to give something away that matters to us? And I'm not just talking about money. Money just happens to be kind of the way in which our hearts kind of become visible to the world, right? That's just part of generosity. And here's the first thing I want us to grasp this morning. I want us to wrestle with this reality, right? We talked about wisdom isn't simply knowing the right thing. Wisdom is learning to live God's way in God's world. And our generosity, right? Our level of generosity reveals who or what that we trust most. I want to stay here for just a second. I'm going to repeat that. Our level of generosity, our willingness to give without expecting in return, our willingness to give to people who we don't even particularly like, our willingness to give for the right reasons with joy, right? Our level of generosity actually is a barometer of trust. It's a question. It's an indicator of who or what we trust most. And that's what Proverbs 11:24 talks about. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. This principle, it sounds so backwards, doesn't it? It sounds just absolutely backwards to us as Americans. How can giving away lead to having more? And how can holding on to something lead to poverty? Because Proverbs isn't describing some sort of economic reality. Proverbs is declaring a spiritual reality, a whole nother dimension of reality. Because, you know what? There's this way of life that we fall into. It's everywhere, in my life too, right? But it sounds something a little bit like this. If I just had a little bit more fill in the blank, I'd be okay. If I could just save enough, that worry, that insecurity will begin to kind of quiet. If I can store away enough time, food, money, guns, whatever it is, I'll finally be at peace. You fill in the blank, right? Unknowingly, we kind of fall into this, if I can, then I will kind of mindset. when it comes to our resources. But here's the problem. Read this sentence slowly. Enough is a moving target, isn't it? Enough is a moving target because we can always have a little bit more. A little more in the bank, a little nicer house, a little newer car, a little better vacation, a little more security. And I'll say it this way, nothing is ever enough for those who view enough as too little. Nothing is ever enough for those of us who view enough as too little. Enough has to be cultivated in us because it's a moving target. It changes all the time. And then when we get to the thing that we set is enough, we find out it's not enough. And what do? We look for another thing that might be enough. This is at the core of generosity. This is why generosity isn't about money, it's about trust. Nothing is enough for those who view enough as too little. And there's this kind of strange thing that happens, okay? I'm guessing you've noticed this. The more that we accumulate, the more afraid we become of losing it. You ever seen that? The more we scrape and struggle and strive and work to achieve something, the more protective of it we become. The more fearful we become. Jesus warns about this. He speaks directly into this issue in Luke chapter 12. Jesus says in verse 22, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothes." Why would Jesus tell us not to worry if it's not something that we do all the time, right? Jesus wouldn't need to teach us not to worry about these things if it wasn't just a human condition. This is what we do. The more we achieve, the more we accumulate, the more we worry that somebody's going to take it away. And notice what Jesus doesn't say here, okay? I want to be really clear. Jesus does not say that possessions themselves are evil, right? It's not up there. Jesus doesn't even say that money itself is evil, right? It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. That's right. It's when money becomes our thing. Jesus says, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or your body, what you will wear, because life is so much more than just food. Here's why. Jesus is asking us, he's calling us to be on guard because greed isn't always obvious in our lives. Sometimes greed just feels like I need a little bit more. Sometimes greed looks like anxiety. Well, what if I don't have enough time to get everything done? That's a trust issue, right? Sometimes greed looks like comparison. Well, why do they have that lifestyle and I don't? Sometimes greed looks like control. I got to make sure that everything is taken care of before I go and help someone else, right? This tendency to hold tightly to the things that we think matter most in the world, it can be hard to spot in our own lives. And this is why Jesus warns us. He says, be careful. Guard your hearts. Because our relationship with our possessions is ultimately connected to our relationship with God. Can I say that again? Our relationship with our possessions, whether it be money or time or resources, whatever else it is ultimately deeply connected to our relationship with God. And sometimes what keeps us from being generous people isn't necessarily a love for money. It's just being afraid we won't have enough. It's insecurity and fear. C.S. Lewis was the author of The Chronicles of Narnia, Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, right? C.S. Lewis once wrote, For many of us, the great obstacle to generosity lies not in our luxurious living or our desire for more money, but in our fear of insecurity. For many of us, the great obstacle to generosity isn't just because we want a bigger house or a nicer car or a better vacation. It's because we're afraid of losing what we've got. Afraid of giving too much away. And this is why Jesus says in John 12:15, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, not just the financial ones. Because life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to our generosity is not our love of money. It's our fear of losing it. It's our fear of not having enough if we give it away. And this is the message in Luke 12. Jesus isn't merely confronting people who just want more. It's not just the insatiable, I need more of this, right? He's confronting people who are afraid of not having enough time or money or energy or resources or influence. And Jesus doesn't just tell us to go chase after more. Jesus turns it into a trust issue, doesn't he? Basically, Jesus is saying, trust your Heavenly Father more than you trust your earthly resources. Because generosity, our generosity, reveals what we trust most. All right, second thing I want us to see, our generosity is really a way that we can deepen our trust in God himself. Our love of generosity really comes down to not necessarily money, but trust, right? And deepening that trust in God. Here's why, right? Generosity can be really powerful because when we give, not just financially, but when we give our time, our energy, our emotions, our resources, our space, when we give of ourselves generously without expecting anything in return, what we're saying, we are literally declaring to ourselves and to the world, my security is not in what I possess. My security is in God alone. What we're saying is that my worth is not in what I own. My worth is in Christ alone. My security is not in what I possess. My greatest treasure is Christ, right? Every time we give with a joyful heart, as Ben talked about, to people who can't give in return, that we don't maybe even like, right? Like when we give that way, we're declaring to ourselves and to the world that our greatest security is in God alone, not our earthly resources. Every time we give that way, we're training our hearts to trust that God is who he says he is, and that he loves us with an everlasting love. Agreed? Agreed. 1 Peter 5, right? Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change with shifting shadows, right? And John's right. I mean, it's all God's anyway, right? The breath in our lungs, the resources, the money in our bank accounts, the cars we drive. And every time we give generously, out of love, we're declaring, God, I believe you. God, I believe that you are my provider. God, I believe that I don't have to cling to everything that I have, that I don't have to protect it because you are. God, I believe that my future is safer in your hands than in my own, right? This is why generosity is not simply a financial discipline, it's a spiritual practice. It helps us to become more and more like Jesus, to demonstrate more and more of our trust. Okay, I'm going to say it this way. Jesus isn't simply interested in getting more money out of us. Jesus wants to get money's grip off of us instead. Jesus isn't just trying to squeeze more money out of us. Jesus is trying to squeeze the grip of money over us, out of our lives. Jesus longs for freedom for us. In Luke chapter 12, a little bit further on, verse 27, Jesus says, "Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these." Do you see the connect between Proverbs and what Jesus is trying to say in Luke chapter 12, right? Proverbs written predominantly by Solomon. And Jesus saying, not even Solomon, the wisest and richest king to ever walk this earth, can compare to the beauty that God gives to the wildflowers year after year after year. He goes on in verse 28, this is Jesus' words again. "If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more?" If you have your Bibles with you, would you underline those three words? How much more? How much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? You see, Jesus wants freedom for us. I don't mean just financial freedom where you never have to worry about money again. That's cheap freedom, okay? Jesus wants freedom for us. Freedom from constantly needing more money, needing more time, needing more power. Freedom from the constant comparison of those who have more than us. Freedom from fear of someone taking it away. Freedom from the anxiety that says, if I don't take care of it myself, nobody will. That's the kind of freedom Jesus is talking about. He's inviting us into this way of trust. Because our generosity is one way to deepen our trust in who God says he is. All right, third thing I need us to see is that our generosity allows us to invest our lives, in those things that are going to really last, right? I mean, think about it. If we struggle with fear around our resources, if we struggle with anxiety around what we've got, right? Our worry is that if we don't invest in the things that matter to us, that it'll all just kind of turn into nothing. But the truth is, it is all going to turn into nothing one day on this side of heaven. And so what Jesus offers to us, what Solomon was trying to help us understand when he said, right, there are those who give and then they get more in return. He's talking about these unseen, spiritual, eternal blessings that long after the bank account is empty and the 401k is closed and the house burns down or whatever else happens, that these resources will continue to provide this beautiful return for all of eternity. Our generosity allows us to invest our lives in something that will last forever. In Luke chapter 12, this is Jesus again, a couple verses later, verse 33. "Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. A treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes and no moth destroys." He's saying, imagine what your life would feel like if you didn't have to worry about your resources. Imagine what your relationships would feel like if you didn't live daily in anxiety about where it was all going to come from. Sell your possessions, give to the poor, and provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. And then one of the most famous verses in all of Scripture, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Notice the order that Jesus gives to us in his teaching. We often think, right, well, my heart's in the right place, right? How often do we say that about ourselves? How often do we say, I just need to trust my heart on this, right? But Jesus warns us. Our heart doesn't determine our treasure determines our heart. It's the other way around. Our treasures dictate the affections of our heart, the thing that we set our desires on most. Where we put our treasure, our hearts begin to follow. Okay, so think about this for a minute. Let's just get really super practical. If you decide to invest in a certain stock market, a stock in the stock market, Do you start paying attention to it more? When you put money in a certain fund, you pay attention to that fund. What if you buy a house? How many of you buy a house, you move in and never touch it again? Anybody ever done that? Yeah, thanks. Right? You buy a house and you start working like crazy. You put more time and more energy and more effort into it, and you got to figure out how to get this and that and the other thing, right? What if you invest in a business? Friend comes along and says, hey, I got this new business I'm starting up. You hand over $50,000 if you got it. Do you just like walk away? Like, it'll be fine. That business will be, right? No. We invest in a stock, we buy a house, we invest in a business, even like in investing in a relationship, right? If you decide you're going to make a relationship important to you, you start spending more of your time and more of your energy and more of your efforts with that person. For those of you who are married, you know what I mean. And if you don't, we should probably talk outside of Sunday. Whether it's your house or your stock portfolio or your relationships, the things that we commit ourselves to, we then start sacrificing for. And that's what Jesus warns. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Our treasure dictates the affections of our heart and ultimately how we spend our lives. I want to go back to C.S. Lewis for a minute because he wrote some beautiful things on generosity. And he said, prosperity, getting more money, okay? Having more resources. Prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, while really it is finding its place in him. You see, the more prosperous we lend ourselves, we commit ourselves to this world, the more the world begins to take up its residence in us, whether we know it or not. The more we care about the things of this world, the more the things of this world begin to take hold on us. And this is the warning, right? Possessions don't just sit outside of us. They begin to work their way onto the inside of us. But Jesus says, in contrast, Jesus says that our generosity can train our hearts to care about eternal things, right? Things that will matter in the long run. And when we give our time and our energy to the work of God in our community, we start to take notice, don't we? About what God's doing around them. About the gospel work that's happening, right? When we've invested in that effort, right, it matters more to us. When we give to somebody else in need around us, our hearts become more compassionate. This is what Proverbs is talking about. When we give, we receive a compassionate heart in return. When we give towards the mission of the church, we begin to care more deeply about the gospel right here in our own community, right? There's this training that goes on in the giving. When we give generously of our lives, our hearts, they become attached to something that is so much more eternal than what we've got right now. Because Jesus isn't trying to take away our treasure. He's trying to keep our treasure from taking us away from God. He's trying to keep the things that we treasure most from keeping us from God himself. All right, last point. The path of generosity leads ultimately to new life. Did you see that part in Proverbs 11:25? I want to go back to that first verse, right? Solomon reminds us that a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. I really like that word, refresh. We don't use it a lot. But if you slow down and think about it, right? You ever noticed that there is really something deeply satisfying about helping someone out of a heart of generosity? Not begrudgingly, not because you are shamed into it or guilt into it or tricked into it, okay? But when you help someone with the right heart, with the right attitude, regardless of the return, isn't there something refreshing about that? Right? Isn't there something that we get in return, right? When you make a meal for somebody in need, And you do it out of love because you just care about that person. And you get home from dropping off the meal and you had a 15-minute conversation standing at the door and it lifts your entire day, right? When you just happen to pay for somebody else's groceries in line without them even noticing. What happens inside your heart? When you help a family that's struggling financially in our community. And you do it out of love, without expecting anything in return. What goes on inside of you? You see, the path of generosity, it leads to this new way of life, this new way of living, right? When you give your time to someone else who needs it, somebody just needs somebody to talk to. When you invest in a child in your neighborhood that nobody even really notices, right? Maybe that overlooked kid in your community. When you serve somebody that could never serve you back, there's this newness of life. There's this refreshing that comes. You often leave more full and whole and complete than when you first started. Because when we pour ourselves out for others, God has this way of filling us back up. It's this beautiful kingdom economy. It's exactly what Proverbs is talking about. Because there's so much joy in knowing that our lives are bigger than ourselves, right? That what God has given me is now being used for something that matters eternally. That my resources, they're becoming someone else's like hope in a moment of desperation. That my life is participating in God's redemptive work around me. And that is the refreshing that Solomon is talking about. Okay, but I want to stop here for a second. Because some of you are thinking like, how in the world did we get there? Right? How do we get to a point where I'm not afraid anymore of losing or not having enough or someone taking it away? Okay, so I want to make it really clear. Nowhere in Luke chapter 12 and nowhere in Proverbs 11 do either Solomon or Jesus say that by being generous, your fear is going to go away. Right? It doesn't say that. I can't find it in either of those two chapters, right? There's no promise that is, if we just keep giving, we'll stop being afraid. That's not the promise. It doesn't mean we're still gonna, that we won't still face fears and worries and doubts of our own. And I know I shared C.S. Lewis a couple times. A couple of quotes, they're powerful. But there's something you need to know about him. As his books became increasingly more successful, right? Lewis made a decision. He gave significant royalties rather than continually upgrading his lifestyle to a bigger house or a faster car. He intentionally gave much of his income away, specifically to bless widows of pastors. And what we don't know about Lewis is that he grew up in a very poor family, extremely poor family. And he spent his whole life living in fear that he would go back to poverty. And yet, he made decision after decision to take the resources that God gave him and to give it away in the name of Jesus, in the midst of his fear. You see, sometimes we imagine that like the generous people, they're just not afraid anymore, right? Sometimes we think that the generous people just don't worry about money. C.S. Lewis, he admitted that he was deeply afraid of poverty his whole life. But instead of allowing that fear to become his master, he practiced generosity over and over and over again. Lewis wasn't generous because he wasn't afraid of poverty. He was generous because he learned to give in the presence of fear. The Apostle Paul, he talks about this in 1 Timothy. He's writing to his protege, Timothy. In 1 Timothy 6:17, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in their wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. There it is. It all belongs to him. And verse 18, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way, Paul says in verse 13, in this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly, say it with me, life. So that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Jesus is offering us a different way of approaching our resources. Paul is inviting us into a new way of life, knowing that our generosity increases our trust in God and decreases our trust in our own selves. I want to end with one question. And I don't really like the question, because I've had to wrestle with it all week long myself. And here it is. What is one thing in your life that if God asked you to give it away, you'd be tempted to walk away from him? What's one thing in your life that if God asked you to give it up? Yep. I know that there are people in this room this morning that God's asked them to give things away that matter so much to them. And I can't know what that feels like, sister in Christ. But the journey towards generosity for all of us, the journey towards generosity for all of us begins with realizing that generosity isn't a financial issue, it's a trust issue. It's not a financial discipline, it's a spiritual practice. And I know that in this room there are people who have been asked to make tremendous sacrifices. But God is still so good. And God still loves with an everlasting love. And he invites us to walk in a different way of life. I want to close with the lyrics of a song that have come to mean a lot to me. It's a song by Keith and Kristen Getty that says, "My worth is not in what I own. My worth is not in what I own, not in the strength of flesh and bone, but in the costly wounds of love at the cross. My worth is not in skill or name, in win or loss, in pride or shame, but in the blood of Christ that flowed at the cross. For I rejoice in my Redeemer, greatest treasure, wellspring of my soul, and I will trust in him, no other. My soul is satisfied in him alone. I will not boast in wealth or might or human wisdom's fleeting light, but I will boast in knowing Christ at the cross. Two wonders here that I confess, my worth and my unworthiness, my value fixed, my ransom paid at the cross. For I rejoice in my Redeemer, greatest treasure, wellspring of my soul, and I will trust in him, no other. My soul is satisfied in him alone."